Hi guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about the Cleer Audio Next. This is an over-ear open-back dynamic driver headphone that comes in right at around $700, so let's take a look. As usual, this video is made possible by the guys over at headphones.com. You can check out my written comments in the community section over there and see what everybody else is saying about this headphone as well. This is a super unique looking headphone, and so let's talk about the design first. This is using a headband system where the adjustment feels extremely smooth. It's really cool to use, and actually it feels as if when you're putting it on your head, it actually stays in place, and it uses the force outwards to ensure that this stays in place. So if there's pressure going this way, it's harder to pull it, but if there's no pressure, it's very easy and smooth. So that's a really cool design. And then there's also there's cup swivel and tilt. It doesn't go all the way around, and it doesn't tilt all the way around either, but there's certainly enough to get it to be reasonably comfortable on your head, or fit in a reasonable position. The drivers in here are also pretty unique. They're using what they call an ironless system. Now, if you look at the design of their driver and their marketing materials, it looks to be a very similar type of driver structure to the formless drivers from Focal with the surround and composite system. So it is already a little bit different from traditional dynamic driver headphones. Certainly it's different from some of the Sennheisers, but also different from the biodynamics out there. I gotta say that the build quality and design here is pretty interesting. However, the comfort still leaves a little bit to be desired. This is a 400-gram headphone, roughly. And while this does use a fairly wide headband, which is nice, it's really not the most comfortable after a few hours. And thankfully, there's not a ton of extra clamping force to create pressure on the sides of your head with this one. It feels like they got that just right. So overall, for the design, I actually think it's pretty good, but I almost feel like too much attention was given to the wrong things here. It feels like there was a lot of emphasis put into making sure that this was super smooth, this system, when in reality, when it's in the right position for your head, you don't really need to change it that much. So making this a smooth action, I don't understand the point there, other than it just feels cool to do. And then on top of it, they actually use these LEMO, L-E-M-O connectors, which for the connector here on the cup. While it is a design that other headphones use, like for example Utopia uses it, in my opinion, it's unnecessary for a headphone that comes in at around $700. It's fine that they paid attention to this kind of stuff, but in my mind, I wish that more resources were put towards ensuring that the sound was really, really good. It makes me wonder why so much attention was given to these other non-sound related areas for this headphone. And then on top of it, it looks like this is the most robust looking termination for a cable I've ever seen. It's a 3.5 millimeter with this 1/4 inch on top, but man, if this isn't ever thick and robust and heavy too. So it feels solid. That's great, but it also feels like, was this necessary? I'll let you guys be the judge on that. All this effort was given to making sure that the design was beautiful for everything else, and they put the best, crazy quality connectors on there. And then the cable is just this sort of basic standard looking cable. It's not really a problem in my mind. It's an interesting choice, and one that kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit. So let's talk about how it sounds. The technical performance of this headphone is good in some areas and average in others. For detail retrieval, it's actually pretty good for the most part, for a lot of the frequency response. Not so much in the bass, and we'll talk about that with the tonality. But in general, I find that it gets, for my test tracks at least, it gets fairly close to the kind of engagement and detail that I like. Maybe not quite as good as some of my benchmark headphones for the price categories. I wouldn't say this is a new benchmark or anything for detail, but it certainly does well enough on my test tracks that I'd have nothing to complain about there. For speed, this is also an interesting one because it does feel about middle of the road for a dynamic driver headphone. It's certainly not as fast as some planars, and it feels like the punch is there sometimes, but not there at other times. So one of the advantages for the formless driver for the Focal headphones is that you get a really fast leading edge transient. It's a really strong attack. And while I feel that this almost gets there, it doesn't quite get on the same level as those Focal headphones. And so if I compare it one-to-one with my Elysia, for example, yes, even though that one's a closed back, the Elysia does have a faster leading edge to it. And so while I can't complain about the speed here, it is still pretty good. It just doesn't have the same engagement quality that I like with these, upper mid-fi, upper high, almost high-end headphones. And it's starting to be at a price point where that is becoming more important, especially given that you now have a whole bunch of planers out there that come in at a way lower price point and are able to deliver much better engagement and control and speed. Again, this is one of those examples of it's good, but it's not great. And there are other headphones that are at a similar price that are great, and especially some of the planers out there. For stage, it did throw reasonably far for certain instruments. Like sometimes it would be pretty far left and pretty far right, but the center image was a bit closer to me. So imagine this is my head here, so it goes out to the sides quite nicely, but then when it goes in front of you, it's as if the center image kind of collapses towards you a bit. And then on top of it, the image separation and distinction was good when things were thrown far to the sides, but again, when it's stuff that's right dead center, for vocals and vocal harmonies, for example, I found it not as easy to pick them apart. And there are, again, other headphones where I've been able to do this. Now, keep in mind, $700, yeah, it's not the craziest price tag, and I think for this price point, it's probably okay for technical performance, for instrument separation. Like, I actually found that this does it better than some of those Bayer Dynamics that get a ton of praise that come in at maybe a little bit less expensive. So in my mind, for the price, the technicalities, it's okay. It's good. However, for timbre, that is one of the major drawbacks and shortcomings of this headphone. I've got my Elysia here. And if you guys think that the Focal headphones have what some people describe as a metallic timbre because they're using aluminum magnesium drivers, I encourage you all to listen to the Cleer Audio Next, because boy does this ever have a metallic timbre to it. A part of me feels like that metallic timbre is from the tonality. So let's talk about that next. This is the HEQ compensation on the Mini DSP Ears rig, which is by no means industry standard, and I'm learning more and more how inaccurate it actually is. But you can see how this measures here relative to other headphones that I've measured in the past on the same rig, and I'll show you guys that in a minute. But for the bass, the Next does extend all the way down to the sub bass, which is really nice for a dynamic driver. Usually they roll off a little bit earlier. And I find that actually, unfortunately, in the bass, even though it has all this presence to it in the sub bass and it does extend all the way down, it is actually still a little bit difficult to distinguish all the detail in the bass. So you might hear that there's a frequency or a tone that goes all the way down there, but you can't really pick it out as distinctly as you might like, whereas other headphones, even less expensive headphones, do that a little bit better. As we get into the mid-range, I don't have all that many problems with it, but once it gets into the upper mid-range and lower treble, this is where the major problems with this headphone start to show up. I'm particularly sensitive to any elevation between 2.5 kHz and 6 kHz, and the Cleer Audio Next has two of them. One is anywhere between 2K and 3K, depending on which rig that you use. And the other is I've seen it anywhere between 5K and 6K. On this rig, it measures around 6K. I think on more precise rigs, it measures at around like 5.5. But nonetheless, they are substantial peaks. And actually, this 6K peak is quite dramatic. You'll notice this here, this 4.5K one is here, but it's just a feature of the measurement rig, and I know that this is consistent on almost every headphone, so don't pay attention to this. But in general, the treble is the worst part of this, unfortunately, because in the consonant range above 6K at around 8K, it's not sibilant at all. It's not offensive, it's not fatiguing, and then there is a substantial amount of air quality beyond that, and it's not overdone. The extension isn't turned up to the max, so it does retain tonal balance like it should, and it doesn't have the same issues that a lot of other headphones that struggle with this seem to have. But nonetheless, this elevation at 2.5 kHz and the other one at 6K hertz. This, well, 5.5 to 6K hertz is probably the worst one. And what happens is it causes things to sound tinny, shrill, and boxy. Maybe the best way I can describe this is imagine you've tuned this to a diffuse field target and then used the worst room you can possibly imagine. These elevations make it sound like you've recorded this, everything you're listening to, in a box. And, you know, the four walls, and it just has terrible acoustics. That's kind of how this makes things sound. And so I'd mentioned earlier the metallic timbre. I have the feeling that a lot of it comes from this elevation at 6K or 5K, or wherever this actually ends up being, and then also the earlier one, which is also a problem. Like this is what ruins snare drums for me. And then when you look at the HPN compensation, you can see it measures actually a little bit closer to the target than a lot of other headphones do, with a bit of extra bass emphasis. But this bump is even more pronounced. So remember that this isn't here. This is just madness from the measurement rig. But both of these peaks are particularly offensive. Again, a lot of the rest of it is pretty good. And you know, the fact that the bass goes all the way down is really nice. And the air quality up top is fine. No sibilance. But these two peaks are just, they kind of ruin it for me. So if you're curious how this compares with something like the Ananda from Hi-Fi Man, the green line is the Cleer Audio Next. Given that this is an imprecise measurement rig, this is only to show how it sounds relative to the Ananda. So where you would expect the elevations to occur. So what I do is I drop this whole range by a few dB. I'm struggling to actually get the 6 or 5.5K, 6K peak down, because it seems like it's not accurately capturing where this is. And I've seen other measurements of this headphone that show it a bit earlier, so maybe that's why. But nonetheless, this was not a particularly enjoyable headphone to EQ either. I also feel like after I did a little bit of EQ, it almost sounded like there was a little bit of haze there. So keep that in mind if you are buying this with the intention of EQing, or if you're considering it with the intention to EQ. It doesn't really make it sound as good as other headphones do. When I first heard about this headphone, before even getting a chance to listen to it, I really wanted this to be a success. I wanted to like this headphone because I love the idea of companies pushing the boundaries as far as transducer structure and design goes. Companies like Focal have done this with their formless voice coils. And when I see other companies, borrowing that idea or coming up with their own idea, in this case, it's the ironless driver, it makes me think, yeah, let's push the envelope on this stuff. Let's do something unique rather than just buying the same standard Fostex biodynamic driver and putting it in everything. So I was really keen to hear what this is going to sound like. And unfortunately, it's not a headphone that does anything for lifelike representation of certain instruments, for snare drums or cymbals or anything that makes use of 6K and above. I find that for vocals and for certain jazz tracks, I actually really like this. When listening to Patricia Barber, for example, which is normally my sibilance test tracks, which there isn't any with this headphone, thankfully, I actually was able to really enjoy the music until it got to a point where there was an overabundance of instrumental hits, snare hits, cymbal hits, where things just did not sound the way that cymbals and snares sound in real life. It's really important to me that they get that right. And it makes me come back to it. I feel like they put too much emphasis and effort on these design things, which, yes, while important, it could have just used a shift and reallocation of resources into the tuning of this headphone to ensure that it does accurately represent instruments in a lifelike manner, the way that they sound like in real life. Those two areas, in the tonality in particular, make it really difficult to recommend this headphone, especially when there are headphones that come in at a much lower price that do about as well as this, and as far as technical ability, and do a much better job in the tonality and frequency response. If I compare it to a similarly priced, you can find this on sale, the Elegia on sale for pretty close to the same price, maybe a little bit more. And I find that while, yes, this also requires a little bit of EQ, it's a much better representation of those instruments. So, in conclusion, do I recommend the Cleer Audio Next? Well, if it isn't obvious by now, I certainly don't recommend this without EQ. With EQ, it is improved, but I did actually find that it doesn't totally get rid of that sort of boxy quality to it. There are too many issues with this headphone for me to give it a full, proper recommendation across the board. I do still have to say that I like the idea of pushing the envelope when it comes to driver technology or transducer technology, and I'd love to see what they come out with next after this headphone, and hopefully they're able to put a little bit more effort into tuning things and getting it to sound a little bit closer to a lifelike presentation of instruments. All right, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.